Please welcome Stanley Yates.
Thank you very much. It's good to see you all here. It's been great this week being part of this symposium, to be in a room for 3 hours a day with people of like mind who think seriously about the guitar and about music. So, thank you all for being here. Thanks especially to Jonathan, Steve, and the Symposium Committee for inviting me to talk about something. So off we go. Things as they are changed upon the blue guitar. The guitar changes things. So the most performed, recorded, and published composer for the guitar is...
Michael Tippett, surely.
It's Bach. It's Bach. The second one, probably Albanian. The third one?
Tippett, come on.
Well, you know, it could be Sohr, Tarraga, Barrios, it could easily be Piazzolla. Why do we do this? Well, it's been going on for an awful long time. With the vihuela, we have countless intabulations of vocal part music, and with the five-chords guitar, we have divises, intabulations of Lully orchestral music, and Mercia's intabulations of Corelli violin music, and his re-intabulations of music by other guitarists. And when we get to the Great Vogue, well, countless arrangements of accompaniments to songs and arias, countless arrangements of arias to serve as themes for variation sets and operatic potpourris, and also a good number of orchestral opera overtures reduced for the guitar, two guitars, the guitar with other instruments. So here we have Carulli showing his readers how they might reduce a piano accompaniment to a solo guitar. And here, an orchestral accompaniment reduced to a solo guitar. Now, at the same time, we have the Russian seven-string guitarists who were just arranging everything they could get their hands on, including six-string Western European guitar music. And by the time we get to the mid-19th century, we have Merck's concert arrangements of Schubert Lieder, along with his recreational multi-volume anthology Cuckoo, 136 short folk song opera aria paraphrases. Around the same time, we have Kost and his Livre d'Or du Guitariste, interestingly subtitled Collection of Pieces and Fragments Extracted from the Works of the Great Masters, applied to the guitar. So this, along with paraphrases of Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, also has the first published guitar transcriptions of lute music and five-chords guitar music. We get to the end of the century, an arranging craze. Tarraga, the first arrangements of Albanian and Bach violin music. Manjan, the first Scarlatti. Jobet, the first Granados and Fire. And soon after, Sinopolis' edition of the Bach Chacan and the Brugger edition of the Bach lute suites, lute music. The floodgates well and truly open. But why do we do it? Well, this is a 500-year tradition, which has led to an adopted repertoire that we treat quite seriously. There are some obvious reasons, just quickly go through a few of them. The practical musicological, converting a tablature into something we can actually read. The pecuniary, to sell sheet music. The pedagogical, to provide familiar music for early stages of study. The explorative, reacting to new iterations of the instrument. And the career. Performers are often very closely associated with their arrangements and transcriptions. And of course, there's a further reason we're all familiar with, but an obvious implication, to augment the repertoire. Well, it's true, our repertoire isn't exactly overburning with major works by major composers. We have some, but we have a lot of worthwhile repertoire beyond that, especially historically, culturally, and geoculturally. But this kind of thing isn't restricted to guitarists, is it? Pianists in particular have been avid arrangers, and they certainly have no shortage of sophisticated music by major composers, literally, at their fingertips. So the fact of the matter is that most musicians have engaged with this kind of thing and continue to do so. string quartets playing Jimi Hendrix and the Piazzolla craze. Here's another reason, a little bit more provocative, and this is to validate the guitar as an instrument of art music by bringing in to the repertoire names such as Bach, Chopin, and Scarlatti. But there's a further reason that we do this kind of thing. And this is to experience at first hand music we become attracted to. Transcribing, arranging can be modes of understanding a piece of music, so we can internalize it, make it a part of ourselves, so we can then express what we know about it, ultimately so we can express ourselves through it. In the process, we bring the guitar into conversation with things outside of itself, and we bring external ideas into the guitar language. Through this, we might learn more about how our instrument can work, how music works, and more about how to express music in general. We might even bring new ideas into our performances and interpretations of the original repertoire. Transcribing and arranging can be creative, expressive enterprises as well. Now, we often use these terms, transcribing and arranging, as we all know, interchangeably, but there are differences between them. Standard definitions: transcription implies literal representation of a piece of music in an alternative form of notation, such as transcribing and tablature. Arranging implies alterations, additions, subtractions, things like this. These are broadly equivalent to postmodernistic ideas of copies, simulations, imitations, recreations, representations. A transcription would be a first-order simulacrum, a faithful copy of an original. Did I say transcription or arrangement just then?
Transcription.
Good, I was right. An arrangement would be a second-order simulacrum, a transformation of an original. But we can also consider transcribing and arranging as lying along a continuum. A number of questions then arise. What might occur at the intersection of the two? At what point might a transcription become an arrangement? And how far along this continuum might we be willing to travel in adopting a particular piece of music? We need to deepen our definitions. So transcription, transcribing, prioritizes fidelity. So a literal pure transcription of a Vuvela tablature, for example. There's no interpretation required. We just objectively notate the pitches and the starting points. There's a Milan fantasy, objectively transcribed. Now, we can enter into a bit of interpretation. We can make a tactus reduction, a polyphonic realization, taking into account things like fingering limitations, cantus firmus, hemiola, metric shifts. Looks like a bit of a departure from the original, but it's still highly objective, and we can expect that competent transcribers will arrive at essentially the same result and a more or less stable text. Nevertheless, this begins to nudge us just a little bit along the continuum. Now, transcribing a 5-chords guitar tablature, this is an entirely different matter. Even if we know the intended stringing, we've still got the still brisé to contend with. This beautiful deceit of multiple voices that don't really exist. And a texture projected by thumb versus finger timbre and the subjective selective plucking of octave courses. So transcribing this kind of thing is often a notational nightmare. And literal transcription for the modern guitar is usually impossible. Here's an example. It's the opening of a divise, Passacaglia. We know divise is stringing, and most of this is strummed, so we know which notes are sounding. Here's a literal transcription. Looks pretty good, but these are not the pitches. These are not all of the pitches. Here we have all the pitches. We don't quite know where to play them, and it's just a mess. If we put this on 2 staffs, with the treble strings on one staff and the reentrant and octave courses on another one, well, now we have everything. We can see exactly what's going on. But we can't play this on the modern guitar. If we realize it for the modern guitar, well, already just in the first couple of measures, we're forced to choose between a number of subjective options. So this moves us a bit further along the continuum, away from pure transcription. And it brings us into contact with ideas of instrumental languages and translation between those languages. The 5-chords guitar, the 6 single-string guitar are different instruments. We'll be returning to this kind of thing. But before we do, let's take a look at the arranging end of the continuum and something that's definitively an arrangement and not a transcription. Everybody. So this is still the Beatles' Eleanor Rigby. There's at least as much Leo Brauer there as there's Paul McCartney. Let's go to a limiting case, even perhaps a little bit beyond, so we know where the limits actually are. This is something we might better think of as influence or inspiration, and we'll have it from the horse's mouth.
Play a thing by Bach, and it went like this. And so it actually goes but we didn't know that second half. And that was a bit we went wrong. But I always liked this little. So years later I then adapted it into the song Blackbird.
Yeah, so I would say that's probably about as far as we can go in adopting Bach for the guitar. All right, let's return to the continuum and what we might find in this intersectional space. So here's a well-known example from the Vihuela repertoire. We don't need to listen to it, we all know it. It's a quite faithful intabulation of a four-voice part song, but with the addition of glosses and idiomatic sonorities, it nevertheless transforms the original. It isn't a reduction or a simplification. It isn't simply a transcription. It's a translation into Vihuela language. And it's a creative reimagining. Here's the first Bach for the guitar. Mikhail Vysotsky's arrangement of a contrapunctus from the art of fugue. Vysotsky adopts the entire contrapunctus, but he doesn't bother waiting around for the subject statement and the first imitation point. He just waits till all the voices are in, and then he starts. Here's a little bit of it, which I had to play on a six-string guitar. So. So there's 4 pages of that he transcribed. So, Vysotsky found something in this piece that was quite alien to Bach's conception of it. Yet, it somehow remains compelling. Beyond its historical significance, it feels inspired, and it seems he simply had to experience this music at first hand. So here's a few more things, briefly. Santiago de Murcia, one of his reintabulations of music by his guitarist contemporaries, which he just changed to suit his own way of playing the instrument. Francois Doisy's adoption of a well-known Viotti violin concerto, in which he didn't just adapt the violin part to the guitar, he also rewrote the orchestral themes to suit his own personal preference. We have Mechedka's adoption, recomposition of a Haydn keyboard sonata, which in the process he took a 40-year-old piece, brought it fully up to date in terms of contemporary Viennese style. A response to a new iteration of the instrument, the guitar with 6 single strings. We can also mention Aguado's personalized elaboration of his friend Soar's grand solo, Soar's rewriting of Giuliani's guitar part in La Sentinelle, Giuliani's rejigging of the Euler 5 exercises, published as Giuliani's Opus 93, 6 Preludes, and we have Giuliani's Handel variations of 1826. Now, 12 years earlier, Moscheles, a sometimes Giuliani pianist collaborator, had already published a set on this theme. And guess what? Oh dear. right, well, for now, let's just say that Giuliani felt he simply had to do this. And of course, we have the Tarraga Chopin Nocturne, which is very popular these days, a highly idiomatic, stylized arrangement that becomes something else. With the unexpected multi-page cadenza, Tarraga felt a need to enter into this music personally and creatively. Still, the question remains, at what point does a transcription become an arrangement? Well, an arrangement occurs when a creative intervention occurs, when we become willing to assume a degree of creative authority. This leads to versions or adaptations rather than transcriptions. Fidelity to the original is no longer the primary concern. It's a creative reimagining, and it can be an art form in itself. What else might we find in this intersectional space? What about the original mainstream composer repertoire? Are the published scores editions, as we refer to them, or are they arrangement transcriptions of often unplayable originals? Well, a distinction without a difference, you might think, but some interesting issues arise. There might be more than one manuscript version of a piece, or even in the case of a single manuscript source, the published edition may depart from it in significant ways, a variant-rich text rather than a stable one. So, for example, the increasing availability of composer manuscripts has revealed how interventional Segovia could be in his editorial approach. The small changes, fair enough, but he could go much further than this, especially with the music of Manuel Ponce. So, for example, the 24 preludes were composed in a clearly structured cycle of relative major-minor pairs, organized in a cycle of fifths. Segovia reduced them to 12, transposed them to duplicate keys, and imposed an arbitrary key sequence. The theme brief finale, Segovia left out 4 variations and reordered all the rest. Well, we might find Segovia's small editorial changes convincing enough, but we might also consider that the composers agreed with or just trusted the suggestions of a single performer. So editing is something else that falls along the transcribing, arranging continuum. It's something that would result in an unstable text in the hands of different editors and their interpretational priorities. 6 editors would produce 6 different versions. Is there such a thing as editorial authority and an immutable edition, exempt from further intervention by subsequent editor performers? Well, let's move along the continuum. What about elaborating, even recomposing originally composed guitar music? Along these lines, at a modest level, we can mention the optional second guitar parts that Mearns added to some of his solo pieces. Might we do something along these lines ourselves? Moving into the 20th century, we have Ponce's take on the Paganini Grand Sonata, a quite personal recomposition and reharmonization. And more recently, Mark Del Priora's recomposition of Sohr's Opus 22 Sonata. Well, let's have a listen. Yeah, so I couldn't record more of it when I was making these examples on Saturday because it really goes crazy after that. But it's not just the imitative counterpoint. It's the modal shifts and modulations that Mark introduces that Sohr himself may well have enjoyed. Listening to this, we might even wonder, do we need a lip service sonata a bigger name composer might have rattled off one afternoon for an amateur guitarist friend patron? I don't know if I'm convincing you. There's a parallel chronological continuum that goes along with all of this. Here it is. As we move along this continuum, fidelity gives way to flexibility, but during the 20th century reverts back. We seem to be much more amenable to historical arrangements, no matter how outlandish, than we are to ones made today. Why might this be? Well, this period of creative inflexibility coincides with the period during which the guitar began to enter the mainstream concert world and the academic institution. Could the regression be an artifact of historically informed overreach, academic correctness, or a validation impulse? Well, we live in a postmodern world with many options open to us, and we're free to travel as far along the transcribing, arranging continuum as we like. Now we can get on to the more abstract stuff. Let's take a look at a literary analogy, translation. Translating a technical manual, for example. Let's say a washing machine manual. A straightforward literal word-for-word translation will do. Competent speakers of both languages will arrive at essentially the same result, a stable text. Now, translating a literary work is an entirely different thing. It requires a sophisticated understanding of the linguistic idioms of both languages and a high degree of interpretation. It's a creative enterprise that leads to versions or an unstable text. If we don't speak Russian, we can't read Crime and Punishment, only somebody else's interpretation of it. Here's a bit of Shakespeare. I'll do my best. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. Not bad. Now, if somebody was to make a word-for-word plain language translation of this into Russian, and then do the same thing back into English, as you've probably guessed I did, on ChatGPT, we get something like this. Should I compare you to a Dane summer? You're actually more lovely and more steady. Summer can be rough. Wind messes with the flowers, and it doesn't last very long. Well, you know, not entirely incomprehensible, but if a translation is too literal, we lose the deeper meaning. And this provides a useful analogue with translation between instrumental languages. Now, in music, we can define idiom as the kind of things an instrument does well, and idiosyncrasy as the things an instrument does in a peculiar way. The aggregate creates an instrumental language. Each instrument has a unique one, along with dialects, different ways of using the instrument within that language. These languages and dialects affect musical meaning both for the performer and for the listener. They shape the way the music is expressed and perceived. The instrument becomes part of the music itself. The sound and cultural associations of an instrument affect musical character independently of the notes. So along these lines, the idea of a faithful transcription, a transcription not only of the notes but of the musical effect as well, this is only possible when the instruments are sonically very similar and articulate in similar ways, such as with the lute, guitar, viola. But even then, cultural associations enter the picture. Again, the guitar changes things. What might the guitar language be? What are its dialects? What is the guitar culturally and aesthetically? Well, on a practical level, the guitar is both a melodic, harmonic, contrapuntal instrument. It can play melody and accompaniment at the same time, but only kind of. But the guitar is also an instrument of evocative timbre and texture. And in this, we begin to find compensation. So beyond the obvious things we all know about, shades of tone colour, let's say, we might consider that open strings and their overtone sets contrast with those generated by fretted notes. Open strings assert themselves. They have their own agency. Still brisé textures suggest much more than what's actually there. Harmonics evoke the magical. And lascia vibrare, over-ringing campanella, suggests something evocative of an ancient harp or lyre, something Orphean. Guitar dialects derive from fingering systems and modes of articulation. For example, the along the string glissando vibrato style of Targa or Barrios, or the subtle détaché preferred by some performers today. Degrees of over legato, from the subtle to the quite pronounced. We also have a compositional dialect that embraces the open strings. You can think of Fire, Villalobos, Benjamin Britten. And a dialect that prioritizes the open strings. We might think of Brouwer's harp guitar style. Well, this is another continuum, and these things we can only do to a certain extent. So I think we can safely say that the guitar is a highly idiosyncratic instrument. Now, on an aesthetic level, the guitar often identifies with something ancient, mysterious, occult, hidden, yet knowing, again, an ancient harp or lyre. Let's have a look at what Garcia Lorca had to say about this. At the circle crossways, 6 maidens dance, 3 of flesh and 3 of silver. Yesterday's dreams haunt them, but they are held embraced by golden Polyphemus, the guitar. Polyphemus, the one-eyed giant of Greek mythology who spoke in many voices, and a bit more of Lorca. The guitar makes dreams weep, the sob of lost souls escape from its round mouth, and like the tarantula, it weaves a great star to trap the sighs which float in its black wooden cistern. What might lay within that cistern, we wonder. Instruments suggest things beyond their physical, objective selves. They hold cultural meanings and independently assert their own agency on the music. Returning to the Wallace Stevens poem, things as they are changed upon the blue guitar. Aesthetically and culturally, the guitar is again highly idiosyncratic. It's always been associated with the popular and the lowbrow. It's the quintessential popular cultural instrument, from which at times highbrow iterations have emerged. And with its high-low serious popular associations, the guitar is decidedly postmodernistic. We'll be getting back to this. Now, this high degree of idiosyncrasy suggests that a high degree of translation is needed when adopting music from outside our repertoire. How might we go about this, especially considering that most arrangements are reductions? Well, of course, we're bringing something in, the sound and the aesthetic, cultural associations of the guitar itself, but how do we further compensate for what we've left out? Well, the idiomatic and creative layers make the compensation. We might even imagine an equation that exists between the musical ideas of the original and its notes on the one side, and a creative reimagining and its notes on the other. An equation implies balance, of course, but an equation isn't quite the same thing as a formula. We need to understand something of the original, what we find appealing about it. And this goes beyond historical style, counterpoint, harmony, the objective facts of a piece of music. It's understanding on a personal, aesthetic, expressive level. Okay, so on the piano, think about the piano language, isolated single lines are often played in octaves, doubly in octaves, not necessarily for volume, but to add more overtones to an expressive timbre. So a very good example is this, that we all know. This evokes this expressive sung cante hondo accompanied by a punctuating guitar. How might we translate this into guitar language? Well, we can do the usual thing of just playing the octaves. Sounds good. But this is equivalent to a word-for-word translation. What else might we do? Well, we could use play as a single line in a number of dialects, which will be more melodically expressive. We could use overlapping lasci vibrae and harmonics. I actually didn't do a good job on this because I should have put more harmonics in, but you'll get the idea. Bit more evocative. Or we can have the full English breakfast, the full Monty. Above the octaves, overlapping, and anything else we can get our fingers on. Get something like this. So this is an example of This is an example of idiomatic translation between instruments. And it's another continuum. And for any particular passage, we decide how far along that continuum we feel it's appropriate to travel to get something expressive and appropriately expressive. Let's take a look at another literary parallel, intertextuality. to some extent, recognizable idea brought in from an external text to subtly enriching the narrative. So at an obvious level, the titles of arranged texted music are intertextual, whether it be of a Whaler intabulation, a 19th century opera aria, a Mertz Schubert arrangement, or a Beatles song. But only if we're familiar with the sung text, or at least its narrative expressive mood. Instrumental imitations, very common in the 19th century repertoire, are also intertextual. On some level, informed listeners will pick up on them. So here's the Cuban popular song Drume Negrita. Feel free to dance.
Drume negrita, que yo va a comprar nueva cunita y la negra verse ya no sabe qué hacer.
And here's Leo Brauer's well-known arrangement of it. Now, to my ear, this appears to intertext the opening measure of the Bach First Cello Suite Prelude. Ba-da-dee-da-dee. Now, that might not have been on his mind at all, but the point is, once we've heard it this way, we can't exactly unhear it. So my apologies. But this subtly changes the meaning of the song. Not in an objective way that we can describe in words. Music is much more abstract than a literary text, but nevertheless. Now, in Albaniath, we have a case of reverse intertextuality. This music often incorporates the guitar as a topic, an intertextual reference that is intended to evoke a nostalgic, nationalistic Spanishness. So the opening section of Leyenda, we don't have to listen, we all know this. We even strum a bit in literalizing it. So in this case, the arrangement becomes more real than the original. The original and the arrangement become simulacra of one another. And we have a piece such as Cadiz, which intertexts a strummed accompanimental guitar that we can't literalize, at least not once the melody comes in. And this intertexts, not that, this. So this is an example of the curious situation we find ourselves in when arranging this kind of music. The guitar intertexting, imitating itself. But still, composers such as Albaniath, Granados, Fire, the nostalgic effect and intrinsic Spanish associations of the guitar intertext well with the nationalistic goals of this music, which makes for convincing translation and arrangement. Here are a couple of examples of intertextuality in arranging Baroque music. Overlapping campanella evokes the vice lute. And cross-string ornaments intertext the harpsichord. These things seem authentically Baroque, even though they really aren't, especially the cross-string trills. But again, it's these kinds of things that afford convincing arrangement for the guitar. It's the intertext. I'm tempted to take this bit out, but I'm just going to say it. It's a bit of an aside, a quick look at the cello suites. So this is the cello at its most idiosyncratic. We don't normally associate the solo cello with Baroque music, where it usually functions as a basso continuum instrument. If we attempt to emulate or intertext the Bach solo cello, we engage in a topic that doesn't really exist, since the Baroque solo cello isn't a recognizable topic. This would be an anomaly that would intertext or suggest the accompanied melodic cello of the Romantic period, or even the guitar dialects of Villalobos or Barrios, let's say. But we can imagine a modern Bach guitar that can somehow sound more authentic than historical correctness or a well-intentioned faithfulness to a score. Anyway, we could say more about intertextuality, but we need to move on to the last bit of this stuff, back to the more prosaic. So let's take a closer look at the invisible, unnotated idiomatic layer. First of all, let's just remind ourselves that the guitar is a low transposing instrument. It's only a couple of notes higher than the cello. And this brings into play an intrinsic darkness and an effective weight. Here's Albani's Pavana Capriccio and the piano original. And here's Tarraga's arrangement of it. A wonderful arrangement, wonderfully performed. But inevitably, the intrinsic darkness of the guitar alters the affective character of the music. In this case, from the light and magical to the heavier and perhaps more nostalgic. These things are hard to put into precise words. So again, faithful transcription between dissimilar instruments just isn't possible. The guitar changes things. And let's take a closer look at this open string business and this lascia vibrare overlapping. So here's a Granados Spanish dance and an attempt to notate the idiomatic layer. So we have open notates for harmonics and open strings and indeterminate ties for overlapping. And here we have the open strings extracted, which reveals a layer of what we might think of as timbral counterpoint. Open strings assert themselves. Now, other things we can consider in terms of the guitar idiom. Key choice. So each key we might explore imposes its own set of possibilities and restrictions on our fingerings and therefore our harmonic and contrapuntal literalizations. Now, we often prioritize the pitches of the lower strings when thinking about keys for arranging. But the treble strings are just as important, especially in tonal music, especially if scale degrees 1 and 5, but even scale degree 3, which defines the effective colour of a mode or a key. And again, all of the open strings have agency, it's not just the basses. We can think about the capoed guitar, which changes the overtone set into something lighter, which we use almost as a matter of course for early music. But we might consider Alan's use of the capo in a Bach suite, where he arranges the movements in different keys, so he gets the best fingering accordances for the counterpoint he's hearing, and then he just shifts the capo so they come back into the same key again. And with a different function, the innovative magnetic capo system and the open frets guitar of Kathleen Koltai. Now, there is so much more to what she's doing with this, and I would just encourage you all to look her up on YouTube. It's really, really interesting. Okay, scordatura. We have a number of small ones that we use all the time, but it's still a barely explored resource. So here's the Russian 7-string guitar tuning, tuned in a close voice chord, which offers incredible possibilities for close voice harmony. Unfortunately, the piece that Angelo Gilardino wrote for me in this tuning wasn't tonal. But here are some Russian-esque six-string guitar tunings along these lines that I've used and that we could consider. The top four strings stay the same with the first string down a whole step. We change the basses to suit whatever key we're playing in. And here are some published scoritures that we could consider as models. The Domenicone's Cuyam Barber, we're all familiar with this, but this replicates the D minor open tuning of the Weiss Baroque lute. And his Sinbad cycle, a series of gradually progressing and regressing scoritures. Or Steve Aaron's scoritures that he used for his recording and edition of the 51 Chopin Mazurkas. Now the thing about scoritures is that we need to be able to think in these tunings, but the ear will lead the way, and we're going to be talking about that as well. But before we do, let's take a quick look at technical density. I don't think I'll bother with my examples here, just for the sake of time. So technical density is the rate of technical actions required to play a passage of music. The higher the rate, the greater the density, the more technically difficult, and more importantly, the less space left for engaging the idiom, the idiomatic layer, and for eloquent expressive playing. So, like composition, which we might define as the idiomatic arrangement of original musical ideas, when arranging and transcribing, we have an imperative to keep technical density to a reasonable level, so we can put it to the most effective expressive and idiomatic use. And this brings us to sleight of hand, fooling the ear. Here's something I came across many years ago that I've never forgotten. It's a passage from an accompaniment treatise by Saint-Lambert. You're all okay with the French, right? So what he says is, since music is made only for the ear, a fault which doesn't offend it isn't a fault. Now this is in his section on parallel fifths. The point is, what actually works, what sounds good, isn't determined by the eyes or a counterpoint textbook. It's determined by the ears and our good judgment. So, reduction is the normal state of affairs when arranging for the guitar. Even though the reduction may be significant, there's still a priority to engage in some kind of fidelity. From this is the idea that the more notes we keep, the less we reduce, the better. Is this the case? Well, let's take another look at the Granados Spanish dance. We have a melody in thirds supported by some kind of quasi-arpeggiated accompaniment. How might we simulate this on the guitar? So the fact of the matter, we don't need all of the notes. When arranged well, we don't even notice any are missing. A well-intentioned attempt to keep too many very quickly becomes detrimental to our idiomatic, expressive, technical density equation. Do we dare actually change the notes to different ones? Well, of course. So here's the opening of the Bach E minor First Lute Suite Allemande, and already in the very first measure, Houston, we have a problem. So this gesture is repeated throughout the movement, and the important thing about it is that the lowest note continues to ring through. If we play this as written on the guitar, we end up with an opening, strange 6/3 inversion. Why don't we just revoice that? So did anybody notice that I changed 3 notes there? But the point is, when we transfer music between instruments, we're making an instrumental translation, not simply a transcription of pitches. The priority is to transcribe what we perceive to be the musical idea, not simply the notes themselves. We're looking for engagement of this idiomatic layer with space left for eloquent, expressive playing. But simplification isn't exactly a simple matter, and I am coming to a close. This brings us to audiation and oral imagination, internal hearing. I wonder how many arrangements have been made directly from a score without a careful listening and internalization of the original. How many arrangements of the Bach cello suites were made from Duart's version? How many leyendas were made from Segovia's transcription as a primary source? Well, these will be examples of third order simulacra. They pretend to faithfulness, but they're copies of copies made without any direct experience of an original. I call them doppelgangers. Anyway. Now, strong readers might audiate well simply by looking at a score, as Amy was discussing this morning. But whatever the case, shouldn't the music be completely internalized before we start arranging it? Sergio Assad made his wonderful Piazzolla arrangements by ear from a live recording because Piazzolla didn't notate his tango music. I've heard Alan here many times playing Bach's single lines, singing along the counterpoint he's hearing internally to go along with them, then fiddling around to try to find fingerings to literalize all of this. You know? Hearing music internally allows us to explore and arrange by ear, experiment and improvise and explore what we imagine, to get ideas and options, get something going, refine it, literalize it, and finally notate it. Over-relying on a printed score just gets in the way. And this is a further distinction between transcribing and arranging. All right, I'm on the last section. And I'm going to cut it short. So this is a special case, which would take several lectures to do justice to. So this is Bach. This is our only access to a truly transcendent body of historical music. It's often an arranging process that we engage in expansion rather than reduction. And Bach often repurposed his music, leaving examples for further repurposing. What did he do? Idiom. Key choice, texture, ornamentation. Just to make it a little more brief, there are two basic guitar dialects that we derive from Bach himself. One is the lute style, the continuo. It's not enough to add a few bass notes. Here's a cello minuet, not many basses there. There's a thorough bass realization, just following very basic rules of partimento thorough bass. And here's a continuo realization of it. If we were to play that along with the cello version, everything would be fine, providing the cello played in C major rather than G, which they normally do. And the second style is a keyboard elaboration. There's our Bach minuet with some basic counterpoint. I'm not going to waste time playing it. And I wouldn't necessarily advocate doing that kind of a realization for a minuet like this. So here's a Bach sonata. This is the A minor sonata realized in a more polyphonic manner. And here is something that I found for sale on the internet many years ago and bought. I don't quite know what it's from, but I suspect it might be the GFA final that I played in 1990. Well, it's a bit naughty of me, I know, but it's just for those of you who may not know that I did actually used to play the guitar. But there's a third approach we can take. And this is in the tradition of Bach pianist arrangers such as Schumann, Busoni, Rachmaninoff, Godowsky, and many others through to the present day. This is arranging through the contemporary lens of the time. Our contemporary lens is kaleidoscopic. It embraces the scholarly and historically informed, the expressive creative, and the continuum that connects them. Again, we live in a postmodern, post-authenticity world. There's no objectively correct when it comes to these things. But there are creative options and possibilities, the effective, the communicative, the engaging, and we're perfectly free to create our own Bach style and guitar language as we see fit. So here's something that embraces the historically informed, the guitar language, instrumental intertexts, and postmodernistic creativity. can all agree that this is a kind of highly creative, communicative reimagining and translation of Bach's single line into guitar language. It borrows from the historically informed, but it transcends the traditional and any ideas of restrictive correctness that might otherwise result. So, to wrap up here, there's much more that can be said about all of this, of course, but the main point I wish to make is that we don't need to be too correct in our creative work. Certainly we don't want to be merely correct. I don't think any of us are particularly interested in reading poetic work delivered and translated in the plain word-for-word style of a technical manual. We can take a few risks, we can express ourselves, we can be provocative, we can do something engaging and creative for ourselves, as well as for our listeners, and we can travel as far along the continuum as we wish. Things as they are changed upon the blue guitar. The guitar changes things, and this is something to be embraced.